Hello and welcome to Ani Short Stories. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Haunted Forest. Holly Arnold had heard the stories of the haunted forest on the Isle of Wight, but they had always seemed more myth than truth, a convenient tale for locals to keep adventurers at bay. It was her friend Sarah's idea to go camping deep within the forest, far from the usual hiking trails and campsite clearings. The deeper, the better, Sarah had said with a grin, daring Holly and their friends, Liam and Nate, to experience something truly eerie. The forest was a maze of towering oaks and ancient pines, their branches reaching like twisted arms in the dimming evening light. The further the group ventured, the heavier the air felt, thick with an unnatural quiet. As they set up camp, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She brushed it off as nerves, laughing along with her friends as they built a small fire and shared ghost stories. As night fully enveloped them, Holly began noticing strange shadows darting at the edges of her vision, just beyond the firelight. Every time she tried to catch a glimpse, there was nothing there but darkness. "Did you guys see that?" she finally asked. Sarah and Liam looked at her curiously. Nate shrugged, brushing it off. "You're just letting the stories get to you, Halls," he teased. But Holly was certain something was watching them, lurking just out of sight. Hours passed, and one by one her friends fell asleep. But Holly couldn't rest. She lay awake, the quiet growing louder and more oppressive, a heavy silence that pressed down on her ears. Finally, she sat up, the uneasy feeling intensifying until it was almost unbearable. Then the silence was broken by a rustling sound, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. She peered into the darkness, and that's when she saw them, faint, glowing figures moving slowly through the trees. Her breath caught in her throat as the apparitions floated closer, faces shrouded and flickering as if made of mist and shadow. They didn't seem to have legs, gliding through the trees, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. Holly tried to wake her friends, but they wouldn't budge, lying in an unnatural stillness. She shook Sarah's shoulder, panicking, but Sarah remained limp as though under some sort of spell. A cold dread seeped into Holly's bones as she realized she was the only one aware of the phantoms closing in. Desperate, she stumbled to her feet, backing away from the ghostly figures. They continued their slow approach, their empty faces seeming to fix on her alone now. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the trees as she tore blindly through the darkness. Twisted roots and odd branches clawed at her, slowing her down, but she kept running, the urge to escape stronger than the pain. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching and twisting in bizarre, impossible ways that disoriented her. At one point, she looked over her shoulder and saw the apparitions were no longer simply drifting. They were gliding swiftly after her, the distance between them shrinking with each heartbeat. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, gasping as pain shot up her ankle. She struggled to stand, but her ankle buckled beneath her weight. She looked around in a panic, and that's when she noticed a figure emerging from the trees, its form hunched and grotesque, covered in matted fur with eyes that gleamed an unnatural yellow. It was not one of the phantoms. This creature was solid, real, and it was watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The creature stepped closer, its eyes fixed on her as though it had been waiting. Holly scrambled backward, her heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had closed in around her, the branches above thickening until they blocked out even the faintest sliver of moonlight. She was trapped. The ghostly figures circled around her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that they were not there to save her from the creature. They were part of it, part of this haunted place that had lured her and her friends into its depths. The creature growled low in its throat, a sound that reverberated through her bones, and the phantom faces contorted, their empty eyes narrowing as though they were amused by her terror. Suddenly, she felt a hand grasp her shoulder. She gasped, whipping around to see her friend Liam standing there, his face pale and expressionless. "Liam," she whispered, clutching at him, relief flooding through her. But he didn't respond. His eyes were empty, hollow, his skin cold and clammy to the touch. No, please, Liam, wake up." Holly shook him desperately, but he remained still unresponsive. Behind him, Sarah and Nate appeared, both with the same lifeless expressions, their eyes dull and fixed on her. They began to chant in soft, whispering voices, an eerie melody that seemed to seep into the forest itself, each word tugging at her mind like claws. Holly felt herself growing dizzy, her vision blurring as the chant echoed in her head, pulling her down deeper and deeper. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the creature, its yellow eyes watching her with satisfaction as her friends' hollow faces melted into the darkness. Days later, the local search party found the campsite empty and undisturbed, as though no one had ever been there. The Isle of Wight locals spoke of the forest with a renewed caution, whispering about the group of campers who had disappeared without a trace, their voices hushed as they warned newcomers to never, ever stray from the path. But some claimed that, if you ventured deep enough into the forest, you could still hear soft, ghostly whispers in the night, calling out the name of the one who had dared to look too closely at the forest's secrets. Ere Holly, the search party combed through the woods for weeks. But all they found was the abandoned campsite untouched, as though time had frozen around it. Holly's journal, tucked into her sleeping bag, held nothing but cheerful, hastily scribbled plans of hikes and laughs they'd share. It was as if they'd simply vanished without ever realizing the danger that lay in the shadows. However, as time wore on, the forest itself seemed to stir with new stories. Locals who dared to wander close to where the campsite had been began to speak of strange encounters. An old hiker named Reg, who'd lived on the island his whole life, claimed that one evening he heard soft, distant singing drifting through the trees. It was a haunting melody, so faint it seemed to be carried on the wind, like an echo of voices lost long ago. But there was one word that stood out, whispered over and over again with an urgency that made his hair stand on end. Holly, Reg stopped telling the story soon after. They described seeing shadowy figures standing in the dark, only partially visible behind trees, as if hiding but somehow wanting to be seen. Each one had empty, blank faces and stood perfectly still, like they were waiting. One man swore he saw a girl with long, dark hair and hollow eyes staring straight at him from a distance as he tried to find his way out. When he called out to her, she just vanished into the darkness without a sound. Soon, rumors grew that Holly and her friends hadn't really left the forest but had become part of it, trapped in a strange, ghostly existence, doomed to repeat their final night endlessly. One winter evening, a young couple, curious about the legends, set up a camera in the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. They pitched their tent near where Holly's group had camped and waited, their nerves taut as the hours dragged on. Just as they were about to turn in for the night, they heard the faint sound of a melody drifting through the air, mingling with the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The couple looked at each other, fear prickling at the edges of their curiosity. The singing grew louder, clearer, until they could make out distinct voices, weaving a mournful tune that seemed to echo from all around. Shivers ran down their spines as they recognized one of the names being whispered. At Holly, a gust of cold wind swept through the trees, and when they looked around, they saw shadows flickering at the edge of their vision. Frightened, they scrambled into their tent, clutching each other as they waited for the apparitions to vanish. But the whispers only grew louder, pressing in on them, until it felt as if the forest itself was speaking, pulling them into his steps. The next morning, the couple was found stumbling out of the forest, dazed and pale, with blank expressions and no memory of what had happened. They couldn't remember their own names or how they'd gotten there, only that a girl's voice had been calling to them all night, pulling them deeper into the forest. As the Isle of Wight residents whispered of these events, they came to believe the haunted forest had claimed Holly and her friends for good. And yet, on certain nights, if you dared to listen closely, you might still hear the voices drifting through the trees calling out, beckoning, waiting for those who would venture too close. And if you lingered too long, if you let the forest whispers pull you in, you, too, might find yourself forever lost, your voice joining the haunting chorus that calls out for Holly forever. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.